Thank you very much. It's a tremendous, tremendous honor and pleasure to be here. To start off, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about myself, but before doing that, I wanted to promise you that by the end of this presentation, I will attempt to answer the 3 top questions that I get all the time. They're very eloquent, very thoughtfully laid out questions. The first one is, what the hell? The second is, why the hell? And the third is, are you serious? So just to start, I actually was born to Egyptian parents. I was raised in Canada, and I now live in the United States. So aside from the identity crisis aspect, I grew up with the expectation set by my parents that I can be anything in the world that I want, as long as it was a doctor or engineer. But in all seriousness, I grew up with a tremendous fascination with serving others. And I've always felt that medicine was my calling and was the way to really advance this personal quest furthest. And in fact, not only just being a physician, but I specifically wanted to be a spinal and brain surgeon. So I did my undergraduate degree in life sciences. I went to the top neurological institute in Montreal and did a master's degree in neuroscience, and then I went off to medical school. Now, the very first day of medical school, and bear in mind, I failed to get into medicine twice before I finally got into my 3rd attempt, so I did not take for granted this extraordinary opportunity. First day I'm sitting in class, the dean of medicine stands in front of the 140 people in my class and says, "Half of what we're about to teach you is wrong. The problem is, we don't know which half it is yet." And there was this sort of nervous, awkward laughter in the room because we all kind of knew that there's a lot of truth to that statement. And then he proceeded to show us a slide, which, frankly, he's the dean of the Faculty of Medicine, so I can excuse him, but this guy is the worst salesperson ever. Because what this slide did is it made a very compelling case that we as physicians are really not that relevant. The outcome of the slide showed that of all of the impact you can have on a person's health, less than 10% is accomplished by clinical medicine. The overwhelming majority is things like diet, nutrition, exercise, mental and sort of emotional well-being, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember at that moment thinking that there's just got to be a far more compelling way to drive impact globally than this. And I had no idea that in a few days I'd receive an email in my inbox that would quite literally change the course of my life. So I got an email in September 2012 about the Hult Prize. The Hult Prize, for those of you who don't know, is the largest business prize in the world. It's actually considered the Nobel Prize for business. And what it is, every single year, former President Bill Clinton selects a major global challenge. And then he creates a call to action to invite entrepreneurs from around the world to build a business to address that challenge. And only one team or one company out of tens of thousands of companies from around the world actually wins that $1 million prize to start the business. So in 2013, the challenge that Bill Clinton selected may actually be the single biggest challenge of our future. And it's the problem of food sustainability and food security. Now, in this particular audience, I'm sure most people are aware of this, but to just punctuate the point, we're sort of in a world where we're experiencing a lot of paradoxes simultaneously. On the one hand, we are rapidly growing in both population and appetite. In the next 20 years, we're going to see a 66% urbanization around the world. Middle classes around the world are, as they become more affluent, are engaging in more consumption of food and specifically meat. So the world is growing, but it's also shrinking. We're seriously seeing reductions in topsoil around the world. We are seeing a tremendous loss of acreage of farmland, and we are using almost 80% of all freshwater supply in the agricultural industry. To put this in perspective, if you were to take all of the land on Earth that we are currently devoting to raising crops and livestock, it would be equivalent to the entire continents of South America and Africa. And for those of you who may not know this, the livestock sector contributes more to greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector combined. So for us, we feel, and I certainly felt at this time, a tremendous call to action because we are quite literally on a collision course. It's estimated that not in 30 years, but in 9 years from now, we're going to have a global 214 trillion calorie deficit. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to feeding every person in the world breakfast for an entire year. That's how much of a food deficit we're going to have in 9 years. So we felt that this was a tremendously urgent and critical problem that dramatically needs a solution, and a solution fast. So we asked ourselves, what is the ultimate culprit here? And it turns out that most of us rely very heavily on livestock, animals, for our protein intake. If you think of a cow requires approximately 20 kilograms of feed just to give you 1 kilogram of edible beef. With pigs, it's approximately 7.3 to 1. And with chickens, it's approximately 5.2 to 1. So what does this mean? It means we as a human species get most of our calories from animals that are incredibly inefficient to raise, and to raise at scale. In fact, for those of you in the room who may or may not know this, we've actually functionally deforested 91% of the Amazon so that we can create more land to farm soy and palm, predominantly to feed cattle. So we essentially eliminated a tremendous amount of the planet's biodiversity. Nobody asked for our opinions about this. We didn't vote for this. But to create more space to farm food to then feed animals we eat. 81% of antibiotics globally are used on animals, not human beings. So we really realized that for us to fix this system, and for us to make sure that we can produce protein at scale that can feed the world, we need to radically rethink the protein that we're looking at. So I put together a team of my colleagues at McGill University in response to this challenge, and we realized that there's a source of protein that over 2 billion people in 80% of the world's countries already consume. And it's actually insects. And it turns out that insects are not only more nutritious, but they're incredibly sustainable. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I'll try not to use the word insects, but rather the term aketa. And a part of this is because nobody in this room, I think, says, I eat cow. People say, I eat beef, right? We've created terminology that allows us to disembody the animal from the actual protein for 2 reasons. Psychologically, it helps people get over the fact that they are, in fact, eating an animal. And more importantly, it helps people appreciate that they're not eating the entire animal with all of the different viscera that might be revolting, but rather a very specific part of the animal that is considered desirable and nutritious. And in our case, that distinction couldn't even be more dramatic, because insects in the wild are typically consuming filth. They're on fields full of pesticides and toxins. There's no sort of regulation or sanitary environments. Whereas what we farm is aketa, and aketa is farm-raised. We feed it the highest quality feed, and just like you can extract honey from bees, you can acquire aketa from insects. So the case is actually very, very strong. If you take 100 grams of aketa, it actually has more than twice the amount of beef as a typical, more than twice the amount of protein as a steak. It has more iron than spinach, and it has more vitamin B12 than milk. But what's really exciting is the sustainability story. Remember how we talked about how it takes 20 kilos of feed to give you 1 kilo of beef? And 7.6 and 5.3 with pigs and chickens, respectively. It takes 1.1 kilos of feed to produce 1 kilo of insect protein, or aketa. So it's one of the most efficient, if not the most efficient, and therefore the cleanest, from an environmental standpoint, source of animal protein in existence. Who would have thought that the word clean and the word insects would actually be married together in a sentence where it makes a lot of sense? Now, many of you in the room are probably from parts of the world where this is not really a traditional part of our food culture. And there's this appreciation for the fact that there's a psychological hurdle that needs to be overcome. And this is true. As I mentioned earlier, 1 in probably 4 people in the world have come from a country where insects are consumed. So the vast majority of people still have not embraced this as part of their diet. But that's not an excuse not to pursue this as a protein source, especially in a world desperately in need of alternatives, and where consumers more than ever are incredibly educated and empowered about the choices they make, and are willing to make astonishing choices if it aligns with their values. So with this idea, the next thing before we play the video, we sort of realized that the main challenge with insect protein around the world, even though it's widely consumed, is actually supply chain. If you go to the city of Oaxaca in Mexico, and you go in the summer, when grasshoppers, or chapulines, as they're locally known, are sold, they actually are only available for 3 months out of the entire year. And because of that, they are hand harvested from open fields. And because of that, they are incredibly expensive. Contrary to popular mythology, 1 kilogram of grasshoppers in Mexico is more expensive than 1 kilogram of beef, chicken, and pork combined. So it's not actually the food of the poor, it's a delicacy of the ultra-wealthy. And a part of that is because there's no supply chain. So we thought to ourselves, this is the most efficient animal protein in the world. It's incredibly underexplored and underexploited, and how it's currently being consumed makes no sense and cannot be scaled. So what if we can come up with a way to actually farm insects on a year-round basis? And what if we can modularize this technology so that you can effectively farm insects anywhere in the world and produce this protein source to everybody? That would allow us to address the problems of seasonality, of affordability, and most importantly, of safety, because we are subjecting these insects to indoor agriculture where we 100% control all of the inputs and most of the outputs. So with this idea, we continued and sort of moved on in this competition, where initially 10,000 teams from around the world were selected. We ultimately ended up in the final 5, and on September 23rd, 2013, Bill Clinton came on stage to actually announce the winning team and the winning company. And if we can cue up the video for the announcement. Thank you, thank you. So this was about 3 years ago. Before we cue the next video, this was about 3 years ago.
From McGill University, Aspire.
This clicker is now possessed. Okay, so this was about 3.5 years ago now, and obviously was tremendously validating for our business, but most importantly, it really gave us the kick to get the business up and running. So the first problem we needed to solve was the problem of farming, and to be able to actually replicatably do this and do this at scale. And to be able to produce at a very large volume and to ensure quality control, we knew we had to turn to technology. What's amazing about insects is that they're considered micro-livestock, which means you can use very, very limited amounts of space to produce incredibly high volumes of insect protein, or aketa. And because of the fact that their inputs are reasonably controlled, you could actually introduce a significant amount of automation to the process. In fact, what we decided to do was to take it a step further and build what is effectively the world's first fully automated cricket farm, which is actually located in Austin, Texas. And what we'll do is I'll cue up the video, but I'll ask the AV crew if they can just turn down the volume so that I can talk over the video and just kind of explain what's going on. So we'll just go ahead and do that. So it's the building in the middle. This is in Austin. It's 25,000 square feet. We actually built this as a R&D facility, or pilot plant. Every aspect of the cricket's life, from the moment it hatches until it's harvested, which, by the way, is a 28-day cycle. So we harvest, at least 12 to 13 times a year. What happens is we inoculate crickets, hatch into essentially miniature versions of who they will be as adults. They're inoculated in each bin, and then for the rest of their lives, water and food is automatically delivered to every single bin. We've invented all of these systems in-house. We have 176 unique inventions under 11 international patents, and an extraordinary team of scientists and engineers on site that have really put a lot of this together. And so the idea here is tremendous precision agriculture. We can tell you exactly how much water was deposited to bin 384 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and how much was actually consumed. And with this type of precision, what you could really do is you could acquire a tremendous amount of optimization over time. Imagine if you could, through a proper agricultural methodology, determine that on day 4, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the right temperature that should be in the room is approximately 32 degrees Celsius in order to induce optimum growth and nutrition. So no molecular genetic engineering. What we're doing is we're simply understanding this organism and how to farm it appropriately, and that just takes tremendous amounts of data, which is very hard to do when you have hard to control livestock in open environments, but very, very easy to do when you have individual systems that are essentially modular units. So what happens after we farm these crickets? Our flagship product was actually a protein powder. So we mill the crickets into a protein powder, no different than soy or whey protein, and it's actually used as a functional ingredient. So we have restaurants, for example, that incorporate it into flour to use it in applications to make bread or dough for pizzas. It's, you know, some restaurants actually will even extract the fat from the crickets to produce a butter, which is actually a cleaner version of butter. You could do a tremendous, tremendous amount. And we have, of course, a lot of companies that incorporate the protein in everything you can possibly imagine, from beverages to bars to chips, shakes, and so on and so forth. And actually, recently, we acquired a brand based out of Brooklyn, New York called Exo. They're actually the leading consumer brand in this space. And they were very popular for producing a very beloved brand of protein bars, and they're sold under the Exo Protein label and retails in a very, very large number of stores in North America and soon in Europe. But what we're doing at heart is we're trying to build an industry. And to build an industry, you need much, much, much more than just one brand and one company. You need an entire paradigm shift. Now, I appreciate that a lot of people recognize that, you know, it's going to take a little bit of conviction on behalf of the consumer for a protein source of this nature to be adopted at scale. But that's exactly why we're doing this business. I think that the days of expecting the consumer to lead you as a business are over. Consumers are looking for inspirational businesses that can define and articulate incredibly mission-aligned values that consumers can be tremendously compelled by and can follow as a basis of how they wish to acquire different sort of lifestyle and behavioral changes. Think of every major company that has shaped your lives. Just the phone in front of you, which is essentially to most of us a vital organ. If I asked you right now to hand the phone to the person to your right, most of you would feel tremendously uncomfortable because of how private this piece of technology has become. Just 20 years ago, not 10 years ago, your relationship with your phone and how you've transacted your lives. People now engage in payments. You can ship money. You can talk to people via video all over the world. This required a tremendous consumer behavioral change. Self-driving cars, the way we communicate, the way we move money around the world. All of these things are tremendous behavioral changes. So to induce behavioral change is not a problem, and it's not a challenge, and in fact, it is how you build a sustainable differentiation as a business. But the challenge is, how do you do it, and who are the partners necessary to actually create that momentum? So what's amazing about what we do is that many of the things that are quote-unquote trends for consumers come very naturally to what we do. We are necessarily a gluten-free product. We are necessarily a paleo product. We are necessarily a no soy, no dairy product. We are necessarily a clean label product, and with a very transparent supply chain. I can tell you exactly what day, which bin was harvested by which employee or which system at a given moment in time. A level of blockchain, before blockchain became sexy, that really allows you to be able to understand very transparently how this is done. The next major frontier is actually building textured acetoprotein. So now we're talking about substrates that you can actually use to produce meat analogs, which is a tremendously, tremendously exciting opportunity for food service. And that sort of brings me a little bit to history. And respectfully, I'll just let the organizers know it's not my tendency to go over time, but I think the timer was actually wrong. It's supposed to have 5 more minutes. Most of you in the room, how many of you are familiar with sort of the fall from grace that lobsters had in the 1800s? One person. So I apologize, this might be boring to you. But in the 1860s, lobsters, and I'm not making this up, in Maine, Massachusetts, and most parts of the United States of America, were considered garbage food. To the extent that if fishermen who used to cast their nets into the water picked up lobsters by accident, they would mince the lobsters and throw this on their fields like fertilizer. If you were a kid who went to school with a lobster roll for a sandwich, you hid that from all of your friends because you didn't want to get stuffed into a locker for being a loser. In fact, and I'm not making this up, lobsters were considered so revolting that they were only fed to servants and prisoners and slaves. And even they didn't want to eat lobsters. Until today, in Maine, Massachusetts, there is a law that says that it is considered cruel and unusual punishment to feed a prisoner lobster more than 3 times per week. Clearly, lobsters have come a long way since. And what it took for that to happen, the key inflection points were, number 1, consumer awareness, number 2, some major social catalyst, and number 3, wide-scale innovation and adoption. The first we already have. There's a sea change amongst consumers seeking transparency, all of the trends we talked about. The second is happening at a frightening pace, which is the social catalyst. We desperately need protein alternatives that are better for our planet. And the third is innovation, and that's where we need to partner with thought leaders like those who are in this room, because it takes way more than just one brand and one company in one country to create this movement. It takes a very bold and courageous, but very inspirational group of entrepreneurs across different sectors to be able to demonstrate different occasions of use, different use cases of this protein source to different consumers in different parts of the world. And the analogy we like to use, of course, comes down to sushi. If you think about 20 years ago in the United States, the idea of eating raw fish for most people was preposterous. And now you can't go a few blocks without consuming or craving sushi. And I think this is an important lesson for us, which again comes back to this idea that change is not only possible, it's inevitable. The question is, on what part of that change equation are we finding ourselves, and what aspect are we driving? The last thing I'll conclude with is that the tremendous goodwill that this generates to any business cannot be understated. We have partnered with the #1 restaurant in the United States, a 3-star Michelin restaurant in San Francisco called Saison. And they have a 7-course menu, $600 per plate, and a 6-month waiting list using crickets on their menu. This is how we're gonna lobsterize crickets. But in the process, we also partner with strategic food services. So we partnered with Levy Restaurants, for example, in North America, who serve almost all sports stadiums. So the Atlanta Hawks, for example, for those of you who watch basketball, they actually served crickets and roasted crickets on tacos and now on hot dogs in their stadiums. And even the Seattle Mariners and a number of other baseball teams are starting to do the same. And we're seeing this trend increase and increase. Just last week, Loblaws, the largest retailer in Canada, launched under their own private label a cricket protein powder that they're selling nationally. Fraser in Finland decided to launch with a bread fortified with cricket protein just last month with a tremendous amount of press. We're talking tens of millions of media impressions in the process. So to most businesses that engage in bringing Aketa to their consumers, there's a tremendous amount of PR value and marketing value because you are educating your consumer about something exciting, and it is a very, very interesting subject for most consumers that is captivating to the imagination. To conclude, it's been a tremendous journey, but in many ways we are just getting started. 3.5 years ago, it was just 3 founders. Now we're 71 employees in 2 countries. That farm that you saw is a baby compared to the next production facility we're building, which will be actually 10 times bigger. And one of the most challenging things for us is actually keeping up with demand. Despite all of what we said about creating consumer demand, in many ways we feel that the inflection point is here, and we can't wait for it to get here. We have to create it because of the sense of urgency and duty we feel towards our planet. So I fervently want to thank you all for your time and your attention here this morning. I especially want to thank the organizers, Jonathan, Annie, and Sasha, because they were very patient with me. I was like one of the worst people to deal with just because I sent my slides out last minute and all that kind of stuff. So it takes a tremendous amount of work in the background to make events like this happen, and it's just such an honor and a privilege. Unfortunately, I actually have to go across the city to present at another conference, so I'm not going to be able to hang out for some of the networking activities today, but my email address is here. I would love to engage in a dialogue with anybody here who's interested in potentially looking to bring Aketa into their own restaurants or into their own establishments, or at the very least, to work with us to spread this incredible message and this movement across the world. Thank you so much for your time.